2 a.m., 4 armed HOA inspectors banging on my door demanding to arrest my wife. Poor guys, they had no idea she was the county sheriff. Want to see a 3-second gun disarm that left the entire neighborhood speechless? Comment what state you're watching from and subscribe to Karen Stories. 9. The real action starts right now. The pounding started at exactly 2:17 a.m. according to my bedside clock. Not the polite knock of a neighbor with an emergency, but the heavy-fisted hammering of someone who believed they owned the world. I stumbled to the front window and peered through the blinds. 4 men in matching polyester uniforms stood on my porch, flashlights cutting through the darkness like spotlights at a prison break. The lead guy wore a badge that caught the porch light gleaming like costume jewelry at a dollar store. His hand rested on what looked suspiciously like a service weapon, and his 3 buddies flanked him like they were about to raid a meth lab instead of a suburban home in Oakwood Heights. Sarah was already awake, sitting up in bed with that peculiar stillness she got when her mind was working overtime. She didn't ask who it was or what they wanted. Instead, she slipped on her robe and walked to the front door with the measured pace of someone who had dealt with late-night confrontations before. Through the door, she called out in a voice that could cut glass, "Warrant. Let me see your warrant and identify your jurisdiction." The lead inspector, a guy I'd later learn was named Greg Mitchell, shouted back something about HOA emergency powers and immediate compliance required. Sarah's response was immediate and precise. No warrant means no entry. State your legal authority or leave the premises. The tension outside ratcheted up several notches. I could hear heated whispers among the 4 men, the kind of urgent consultation that happens when a plan goes sideways. "Mrs." Jenkins' curtains twitched across the street, and I caught the blue glow of cell phone cameras recording from at least 3 different windows. The whole neighborhood was awake now, drawn by the commotion like moths to a flame. Greg stepped closer to the door, his voice taking on a threatening edge as he announced they were conducting an official inspection for violations of community safety standards. Sarah's laugh through the door was sharp and humorless. "Official inspection at 2 a.m. with firearms. You boys need to check your training manual." The power suddenly cut out, plunging the entire block into darkness except for the flashlights held by our uninvited guests. Emergency generators hummed to life in the distance, but our street remained black as pitch. It felt orchestrated, like someone had thrown a switch to create maximum intimidation factor. The 4 men seemed to take this as their cue to advance, but Sarah's voice cut through the darkness again, calm and absolutely authoritative. "I'm recording this entire interaction, and dispatch has been notified of your presence. You have 30 seconds to produce legal documentation or vacate the property." The effect was immediate and electric. The confident swagger of moments before evaporated, replaced by uncertain shuffling and more frantic whispering. Within 60 seconds, the power flickered back on, and our mystery visitors were retreating to a dark SUV parked 2 houses down. No lights, no license plate visible, just shadows melting into the night like they'd never been there at all. Sarah deadbolted the door and turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before, part protective spouse and part something else entirely. "Tomorrow I'll explain everything she said, but tonight just know that those men have no legal authority whatsoever." As I watched her check the window locks with professional efficiency, I realized my wife of 8 years might be full of surprises I'd never imagined. The whole situation felt surreal, like we'd been dropped into someone else's drama without warning. 6 months ago, we'd moved to Oakwood Heights specifically for the quiet suburban atmosphere and highly rated schools. Greg had been our unofficial welcome wagon, showing up with a casserole and enthusiastic recommendations about the neighborhood watch program. He'd seemed like the perfect neighbor, always ready with a helpful suggestion or community update. Now, seeing him in that ridiculous uniform barking orders at my front door, I wondered how I'd missed the warning signs that were probably flashing neon bright in hindsight. The fence dispute had started innocently enough 3 weeks earlier. Our property line backed up to a small creek, and the old chain link was rusting through in several places. Sarah and I decided to replace it with a 6-foot privacy fence, something attractive that would give us a bit more seclusion without blocking anyone's view of anything important. We'd pulled the permits, hired a licensed contractor, and followed every regulation to the letter. The fence was beautiful, professional, and completely within our rights as property owners. That's when Greg had started making his helpful suggestions about community aesthetics and sightline considerations. The first letter arrived on expensive letterhead claiming to represent Carmichael Associates, a law firm I'd never heard of. It demanded immediate removal of our fence due to violation of neighborhood covenants and threatened substantial fines for noncompliance. The language was formal and intimidating, filled with legal jargon about property values and community standards. When I called the number listed, I got a voicemail box that sounded legitimate enough. It wasn't until I did a reverse lookup that I discovered Carmichael Associates didn't exist, and the phone number was registered to a virtual office service in Nevada. Someone was playing games with fake legal documents, and they'd chosen the wrong family to mess with. Sarah had been unusually quiet during the fence controversy, listening to my complaints about pushy neighbors and fake lawyers with the patience of someone who'd heard it all before. She'd taken photos of every document, saved every voicemail, and kept detailed notes of every interaction with Greg and his suddenly concerned HOA friends. When I asked why she was being so thorough, she'd smiled and said old habits die hard. I'd assumed she meant her background in property management, but as I watched her methodically check our security system after the 2 a.m. visit, I realized there might be more to Sarah's old habits than I'd ever suspected. The recorder sat on our kitchen counter the next morning, a small digital device I'd never seen before but which Sarah handled with obvious familiarity. She pressed play, and our conversation from the night before filled the kitchen with crystal clarity, every word preserved in perfect detail. But there was more audio from outside the house that should have been impossible to capture, unless you knew exactly where to place listening equipment. Sarah's technical knowledge was impressive and slightly unsettling, suggesting skills and experience that went way beyond anything she'd mentioned during our courtship. As she saved the files to an encrypted drive, she looked up and asked quietly, "Do you want to know what I really do for a living?" The revelation hit me like a freight train loaded with irony. My wife Sarah wasn't just a county employee with weekend shifts. She was the newly elected sheriff of Grandview County, responsible for law enforcement across 847 square miles and 127,000 residents. She'd been keeping her professional identity quiet to protect our family from the kind of targeting that came with high-profile law enforcement positions, especially in an era when police officers faced threats both online and offline. The decision made perfect sense once she explained it, but it left me wondering what other surprises were hiding behind her calm exterior and methodical approach to our neighborhood drama. Sarah's campaign had focused heavily on transparency and community engagement issues that resonated strongly with voters, tired of scandals and cover-ups in the previous administration. She'd run on a platform of modernizing departmental procedures and bridging the gap between law enforcement and civilian communities, particularly in light of ongoing national debates about police accountability and public safety. Funding. The election had been closer than expected, with her opponent raising questions about her qualifications and commitment to traditional law enforcement values. Now sitting in our kitchen while she explained the political landscape she navigated daily, I understood why she'd been so careful about maintaining our privacy and normal suburban appearance. The fake legal documents were just the beginning of what Sarah recognized as a coordinated harassment campaign. Over the next week, our Nextdoor account exploded with anonymous posts questioning our commitment to neighborhood security and suggesting we might be connected to suspicious activity in the area. The posts were carefully crafted to sound concerned rather than accusatory, using dog whistle language about outsiders and community values that tapped into broader anxieties about immigration and changing demographics. Someone was exploiting the same social media dynamics that had weaponized local Facebook groups across America, turning neighbors against each other with manufactured outrage and carefully planted suspicions. Greg's transformation from friendly neighbor to self-appointed community enforcer accelerated dramatically after our fence went up. Suddenly, our grass was a quarter-inch too tall, according to his measurements. Our garbage cans were positioned incorrectly for optimal aesthetic appeal, and our boat cover was the wrong shade of blue for the neighborhood's earth tone requirements. Each violation came with an official-looking citation printed on HOA letterhead and delivered with the solemnity of a federal indictment. The citations referenced ordinances that didn't exist and imposed fines that had no legal basis, but they looked legitimate enough to fool most homeowners into compliance or payment. Sarah's background in law enforcement gave her a unique perspective on the psychological tactics being employed against us. The escalating demands, the manufactured urgency, the appeal to community authority, all classic elements of manipulation designed to overwhelm targets and force submission without legal recourse. She began documenting everything with the methodical precision of someone building a case, photographing each citation, recording every conversation, and maintaining detailed logs of all interactions with HOA representatives. Her professional experience had taught her that bullies relied on their victims' ignorance of the law and reluctance to challenge authority, even fake authority wielded by small-time tyrants. The 2 a.m. power outage wasn't a coincidence, as we discovered when Sarah contacted the utility company the next morning. Someone had called in a fraudulent emergency report claiming gas leak concerns at multiple addresses on our street, triggering an automatic safety shutdown of electrical service to the entire block. The timing coincided perfectly with the arrival of Greg's uniformed squad, suggesting coordination and premeditation that elevated their harassment from petty neighborhood dispute to potential criminal conspiracy. Sarah's contacts in the sheriff's department began quietly investigating the utility company's records, while she continued gathering evidence from our domestic front. When the power came back on and Greg's crew retreated to their unmarked SUV, Sarah had activated recording equipment I didn't know we owned. The audio files captured not just their retreat but also fragments of conversation that revealed this wasn't their first nocturnal visit to a neighborhood home. References to delivery dates and removal schedules suggested a systematic operation targeting multiple families with our resistance, representing an unexpected obstacle to plans that had apparently succeeded elsewhere. The recordings would later prove crucial when federal investigators began connecting dots across multiple states and jurisdictions. Greg's next move was to organize what he called an emergency community meeting to address the security concerns raised by our fence installation and uncooperative attitude toward neighborhood governance. The meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday evening in the common area behind our house, convenient for maximum visibility and community pressure. Flyers appeared on every doorstep announcing the meeting and encouraging attendants to discuss recent developments affecting everyone's safety and property values. The language was carefully neutral but loaded with implications that our family represented some kind of threat to the neighborhood's stability and security. Sarah spent the week before the meeting preparing her own presentation, gathering documents that would expose Greg's fraudulent authority and reveal the scope of what we were actually dealing with. Her investigation had uncovered a network of shell companies connected to aggressive property flipping schemes with HOA harassment, serving as a pressure tactic to force quick sales below market value. The pattern had been replicated in at least 6 different states, targeting military families, single mothers, and other demographics that might be vulnerable to authoritarian intimidation. Our case was just one piece of a much larger puzzle that federal authorities had been investigating for months. The night before the community meeting, Sarah showed me her sheriff's badge for the first time since our marriage. It was smaller than I'd expected, but unmistakably official, with the weight and authority of real law enforcement behind it. She'd kept it locked in a safe I hadn't known existed, along with service weapons and equipment that painted a very different picture of my wife's daily responsibilities. As she prepared her badge and credentials for the next evening's confrontation, she explained that Greg and his associates had been targeting us specifically because someone had identified her as a potential obstacle to their operation. They'd picked the wrong obstacle. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of autumn chill that made people want to get indoors quickly, but 37 neighbors gathered on the grass behind our property line, drawn by curiosity, and Greg's promises of shocking revelations about community security. Greg had transformed himself into a completely different person, wearing what appeared to be an official security uniform complete with patches, badges, and equipment that looked convincingly professional from a distance. He'd set up a folding table with a laptop, clipboard, and stack of papers that suggested official documentation, playing the role of law enforcement consultant with obvious relish and disturbing competence. His presentation began with statistics about property crime and home invasions that were designed to create anxiety rather than inform numbers pulled from national databases and presented without context about our actual neighborhood safety record. Greg spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to being believed without question, referencing his professional experience in security assessment and risk management. He claimed that our fence installation had created sightline obstacles that compromised neighborhood surveillance capabilities, potentially enabling criminal activity that could affect everyone's insurance rates and property values. The crowd murmured with concern as he painted our privacy fence as a threat to community welfare. Sarah had been watching from our back deck, dressed in a simple black blazer with no visible badge or law enforcement indicators. When Greg opened the floor for community input about addressing the security concerns our family had created, she stepped forward with the calm confidence of someone who'd testified in court hundreds of times. Her voice carried clearly across the gathering as she asked Greg to provide his credentials for making law enforcement recommendations and his authority for conducting official security assessments in their jurisdiction. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Greg's confident demeanor flickered for just a moment before he recovered with bluster about professional experience and community responsibility. Sarah's laptop connected wirelessly to a portable projector she'd set up with theatrical precision, and the first slide appeared on the white sheet she'd hung between 2 trees. It showed the official Grandview County Sheriff's Department roster, a complete list of sworn officers and civilian personnel authorized to conduct law enforcement activities in our jurisdiction. Greg's name appeared nowhere on the list, despite his claims of professional security experience and official consultation status. The crowd shifted uncomfortably as Sarah methodically destroyed Greg's credibility with public records requests and employment verification databases that revealed a very different story about his background and qualifications. The second slide showed purchase records from Police Supply Plus, an online retailer that sold realistic law enforcement equipment to security companies and apparently to anyone with a credit card and questionable intentions. Greg had ordered badges, patches, and uniform accessories shipped directly to 742 Elmwood Drive, his home address, with delivery confirmation dated just 2 weeks before our fence installation began. The items were clearly labeled as novelty or security company use, not authorized law enforcement equipment, making Greg's impersonation of official authority a clear violation of state impersonation statutes. Several neighbors pulled out phones to photograph the evidence as Sarah calmly narrated Greg's transformation from neighbor to fake cop. The audio recordings from the previous weekend played clearly through Sarah's portable speaker system, capturing Greg's conversation with his uniformed associates about delivery dates and removal schedules that had nothing to do with community security. The voices were unmistakably identifiable, discussing logistics for targeting specific families and coordinating with someone called Victor about property acquisition timelines. Greg's face went through several color changes as his own words provided evidence of conspiracy and coordination that extended far beyond neighborhood governance disputes. The crowd's mood shifted dramatically as they realized they'd been manipulated by someone with ulterior motives masquerading as community concern. When Greg realized his authority was being systematically demolished in front of his audience, he made the mistake that transformed him from con artist to criminal. His hand moved toward the weapon on his belt with the jerky motion of someone whose fantasy was colliding hard with reality, but he'd never faced anyone with Sarah's training and experience. Her response was so fast it seemed like magic, a fluid motion that disarmed, controlled, and restrained Greg in less than 3 seconds while barely disturbing the papers on his presentation table. The distinctive sounds of zip-tie restraints and Miranda rights being recited created a surreal soundtrack for what had become the neighborhood's most memorable community meeting. Sarah's badge appeared as she identified herself to the stunned gathering, her voice shifting into the official tone of law enforcement, conducting an arrest. Greg was charged with impersonating a police officer, aggravated assault with a weapon, and conspiracy to commit fraud, serious felonies that would require federal involvement, given the multi-state scope of the operation they'd uncovered. His 2 associates, who'd been recording the meeting from a parked van, tried to leave quietly but found their exit blocked by unmarked vehicles that had arrived during Sarah's presentation. The neighbors who'd gathered to hear about community security concerns instead witnessed the arrest of a criminal conspiracy that had been operating under their noses for months. As Greg was loaded into a patrol car that had been standing by just out of sight, he made one final attempt to regain control by shouting that Sarah and I had been targeted long before we moved to Oakwood Heights. Someone had identified us as potential obstacles and had orchestrated our harassment from the moment we'd signed our mortgage documents. His revelations suggested a level of planning and research that elevated the operation from local property scam to organized criminal enterprise. The investigation was about to get much bigger than anyone had imagined, with implications that would reach into multiple states and federal jurisdictions. Monday morning brought a convoy of unmarked vehicles and federal agents who transformed our quiet neighborhood into the nerve center of a multi-state investigation that had been building momentum for 8 months. Captain Rodriguez from the State Bureau of Investigation arrived with Detective Maria Santos, a specialist in financial crimes, who'd been tracking patterns of property fraud across the Southwest since early spring. The scope of what they'd uncovered dwarfed our local harassment campaign, revealing a sophisticated operation that had successfully displaced over 40 families across 6 states, using tactics that exploited both legal loopholes and psychological manipulation. The search warrant for Greg's property yielded a treasure trove of evidence that painted a picture of systematic criminal enterprise disguised as community governance. His home office contained detailed files on target families, complete with financial records, employment information, and vulnerability assessments that read like military intelligence briefings. The files revealed why we'd been selected, our recent move, my engineering job, and Sarah's undisclosed law enforcement position had marked us as both valuable targets and potential threats to their operation. The level of research and planning demonstrated criminal sophistication that went far beyond neighborhood disputes or property speculation. Victor Hale emerged as the central figure in what investigators dubbed Operation Clean Sweep, a property acquisition scheme that used fake HOA enforcement to create artificial legal pressure on homeowners who couldn't afford extended legal battles. Hale's shell companies had purchased distressed properties from families who'd been systematically harassed into quick sales, then flipped them for substantial profits, while maintaining plausible deniability about the methods used to acquire them. The scheme exploited public confusion about HOA authority and property law, targeting demographics that were statistically less likely to challenge legal intimidation or verify official claims. The timing of Hale's operation coincided with broader national discussions about housing affordability and property rights that had many Americans feeling vulnerable about homeownership security. Social media campaigns had amplified fears about property crime and community safety, creating psychological conditions that made Hale's fake authority figures more credible to stressed homeowners. The operation had specifically targeted military families during deployment cycles and recent immigrants who might be uncertain about American property law demographics that were less likely to immediately recognize fraudulent legal documents or challenge official-seeming authority figures. Detective Santos explained how the scheme exploited the same social media manipulation tactics that had influenced recent elections and public health debates, using Nextdoor and Facebook to spread manufactured concerns about community, safety, and property values. Fake accounts had amplified every complaint and suspicion, creating artificial consensus that legitimate residents were threatening neighborhood stability. The psychological pressure combined with fake legal documents and uniformed intimidation had convinced dozens of families to sell their homes rather than fight harassment they believed was legally sanctioned by community authorities. The federal investigation had been tracking Hale's network since spring, when military families at 3 different bases reported similar harassment patterns that suggested coordination beyond local disputes. The Department of Justice had opened a RICO investigation after discovering shell companies in Nevada, Delaware, and Texas that were connected to property flipping operations in suburban developments across multiple states. Our resistance to Greg's intimidation tactics had provided investigators with the first real-time look at the operation's methods, giving them evidence needed to obtain broader surveillance warrants and financial investigation powers. Hale's arrest in Las Vegas came as he was boarding a flight to the Cayman Islands, with suitcases full of property documents and offshore banking information that suggested the operation's profits were being laundered through international real estate investments. His 2 associates from the 2 a.m. visit were arrested simultaneously in neighboring counties, caught with additional fake law enforcement equipment and target lists that included families in Arizona and Colorado. The coordination of the arrests demonstrated federal law enforcement's growing sophistication in handling multi-jurisdictional white-collar crime that exploited local community structures. The evidence recovered from search warrants painted a picture of American suburban anxiety being weaponized for profit, with legitimate concerns about property values and community safety twisted into tools for criminal exploitation. Hale's organization had identified homeowners who were vulnerable due to financial stress, family circumstances, or unfamiliarity with local legal systems, then systematically applied pressure designed to force quick property sales below market value. The scheme represented a new evolution in real estate fraud, one that exploited social media dynamics and political polarization to create artificial legal crises that seemed legitimate to victims and communities alike. Federal prosecutors announced that charges would include racketeering, wire fraud, extortion, and civil rights violations under statutes designed to protect homeowners from discriminatory lending and property practices. The civil rights angle was particularly significant because the scheme had disproportionately targeted minority families and military personnel demographics that were specifically protected under federal housing law. The maximum sentences for the combined charges could result in decades of federal prison time, ensuring that Hale and his associates would face consequences proportional to the scale of their operation and the number of families they victimized. The investigation's findings were briefed to congressional committees concerned with housing security and domestic terrorism, as Hale's methods bore disturbing similarities to tactics used by extremist groups to destabilize minority communities and Democratic-leaning suburban areas. The scheme had created artificial property crises that drove away educated, stable families while concentrating ownership in shell companies controlled by a small group of investors. The political implications were still being analyzed, but early indications suggested the operation had been designed to influence local demographics and electoral outcomes, in addition to generating illegal profits from property manipulation. The transformation of our neighborhood began immediately after Hale's arrest, as residents who'd been quietly intimidated by Greg's fake authority suddenly found their voices and began sharing stories of harassment they'd endured in silence. Mrs. Jenkins revealed she'd been secretly recording the 2 a.m. confrontation from her bedroom window, providing additional evidence that strengthened the federal case and demonstrated how community members had been protecting each other, despite feeling powerless to challenge what they believed was legitimate authority. Her footage showed the coordinated nature of the operation and the professional equipment used to create intimidation that went far beyond neighborhood disputes. The HOA restructuring process became a model for community governance reform, with new bylaws requiring verification of credentials for anyone claiming security or legal authority in neighborhood matters. Sarah facilitated community education sessions about recognizing legitimate law enforcement, understanding property rights, and documenting harassment that taught residents how to protect themselves from future manipulation attempts. The sessions were attended by families from across the county who'd heard about our experience and wanted to learn how to identify and resist similar schemes that might target their communities. Federal seizure of Hale's assets generated a victim compensation fund that helped displaced families recover financial losses and in some cases return to properties they'd been forced to sell under duress. The legal precedent established by successful prosecution of the conspiracy created new tools for federal authorities to investigate similar schemes that exploited community governance structures for criminal purposes. Property law firms across multiple states began reviewing cases involving suspicious HOA enforcement to identify additional victims and potential copycat operations that might have learned from Hale's methods. Greg's sentencing hearing provided closure for our neighborhood and insight into the personal psychology that had driven his transformation from friendly neighbor to criminal conspirator. His background revealed a pattern of failed attempts to obtain legitimate law enforcement employment rejection by multiple police departments due to psychological evaluations that identified concerning authoritarian tendencies and difficulty with appropriate use of authority. His association with Hale had provided an outlet for his need to exercise power over others, demonstrating how criminal organizations recruit individuals whose personal inadequacies make them willing participants in illegal schemes. The broader investigation continued to uncover additional cells of Hale's operation in states where demographic targeting had been most sophisticated, with particular focus on suburbs near military installations and communities with significant immigrant population. Federal task forces were deployed to Arizona, Colorado, and North Carolina, where similar property fraud schemes had been reported, using evidence from our case to develop profiles and investigation techniques that could identify and disrupt copycat operations before they could displace additional families. The investigation had revealed a nationwide vulnerability in suburban governance structures that required federal attention and legislative solutions. 3 months after the arrests, an anonymous postcard arrived at our house with a simple message that chilled us both, despite the warm spring weather. "You stopped one operation, but there are more, and next time we'll be ready for Sheriff Walker." The message suggested that Hale's network had connections to other criminal organizations that viewed our successful resistance as a threat to their own operations. Sarah immediately forwarded the postcard to federal investigators, who confirmed that similar threats had been received by other families who'd successfully challenged property fraud schemes in different states. The postcard triggered a federal investigation into connections between property fraud operations and domestic extremist groups who saw suburban destabilization as a pathway to broader social chaos that could serve their political objectives. Intelligence analysts discovered that some property manipulation schemes were being funded by organizations with ties to white nationalist groups who sought to create artificial demographic changes in suburban communities. The revelation elevated our case from financial crime to domestic terrorism investigation, with implications for national security agencies that had been tracking extremist infiltration of local governance structures. Sarah's role in exposing the conspiracy led to her appointment as a federal task force coordinator for community-based financial crimes, a position that allowed her to develop nationwide protocols for identifying and investigating similar schemes before they could victimize additional families. Her experience bridging local law enforcement and federal investigation became a model for addressing criminal operations that exploited the complexity of American governance structures to avoid detection and prosecution. The task force's work would eventually lead to congressional legislation strengthening federal oversight of HOA governance and property management companies. Our story became a case study in federal law enforcement training programs, demonstrating how ordinary citizens could resist criminal manipulation when they understood their rights and had access to proper legal resources. The investigation's success relied on community cooperation and careful documentation that turned victims into witnesses and neighborhood disputes into federal criminal cases. The lessons learned from Operation Clean Sweep influenced federal policy on suburban security and community governance, providing tools for other families who might face similar manipulation in the future. The enduring message of our experience was that legitimate authority operates transparently and welcomes verification, while fake authority relies on intimidation and discourages questions about credentials or jurisdiction. Citizens who understand the difference between real and manufactured legal pressure can protect themselves and their communities from criminal exploitation that masquerades as legitimate governance. The investigation proved that organized resistance to criminal manipulation could succeed when ordinary people refused to be intimidated by fake authority, and instead demanded verification of credentials and legal basis for any enforcement action. Today, our 6-foot fence still stands as a symbol of property rights and legitimate resistance to criminal intimidation. The Neighborhood Watch program we established operates under strict protocols that require verification of credentials and transparency in all security-related activities. Mrs. Jenkins leads the community documentation team that records and verifies any claims of official authority, ensuring that future manipulation attempts will be immediately identified and reported to appropriate law enforcement agencies. Our experience taught us that community safety depends not on blind obedience to authority figures but on educated citizens who understand their rights and aren't afraid to demand accountability from those who claim to represent legitimate power. What happened to us could happen to any family in any neighborhood where criminal organizations see opportunity in community anxiety and governance confusion. But our story also proves that ordinary people have more power than they realize when they refuse to be intimidated and instead demand verification of authority and transparency in enforcement actions. The real heroes of this story weren't the law enforcement professionals who eventually brought justice, but the neighbors who documented evidence, supported each other, and refused to accept that intimidation was normal or acceptable in American communities. If you've experienced similar harassment from HOA officials or anyone claiming community authority, document everything, verify all credentials, and don't hesitate to contact law enforcement when your rights are being violated. Every family that stands up to this kind of manipulation makes it harder for criminal organizations to exploit community governance structures for illegal profit. Your resistance matters, your documentation helps, and your refusal to be intimidated protects not just your family but your entire community from criminal exploitation disguised as legitimate authority. This is exactly the kind of story that makes Karen Stories 9 different from every other channel, telling tales of neighborhood drama and community conflict. We dig deeper than surface-level complaints to uncover the real criminal enterprises that exploit ordinary family disputes for extraordinary illegal profits. Each investigation reveals new tactics used by sophisticated criminal organizations that target suburban communities with precision and planning that most victims never recognize until it's too late. Subscribe to Karen Stories 9 and hit that notification bell to join our community of viewers who understand that the most dangerous criminals often wear the uniforms of fake authority and speak the language of legitimate community concern. Check out our previous episodes where we've exposed similar criminal conspiracies hiding behind homeowner associations, property management companies, and community governance structures across America. Every story we tell connects to broader patterns of criminal exploitation that target the very communities where families seek safety and stability for their children. Your support helps us continue investigating these cases and sharing the tools families need to protect themselves from criminal manipulation disguised as neighborhood improvement and community safety.